So we're going to move quickly into this next session. So I bet we all want to know, we ask this question, what's your technology worth? Having dry mouth, sorry. And you guys want to come on up? Everybody? Everyone?
Grabbing our mics.
Oh, okay, got it. Sorry, we're doing mic switch off. This is not just about, this is not about price tag. There is worth within the whole ecosystem of the healthcare system. So we brought to a really interesting group of people together to talk about it. And a last minute addition, Lisa Sunin, who was able to get out of jury duty and join us for this great session. So we're going to welcome them to the stage right after they get mic'd up.
At the end? Where do you want me? At the end? Yeah.
Go down there.
Yeah.
Move down.
Oh, am I down? Oh, okay.
Oh, now I'm mixed up. Boy, girl, boy.
You'll get the order right.
Now I'm really mixed up. They sat out of order.
Uh-oh.
Thank you for hanging in here, and I hope beyond this panel you'll stay for the exciting presentation by Yves Béhar, and then we have 4 startups that you haven't seen yet today who will be doing lightning pitches after that. I've been promised that there's beer and pretzels that will be arriving at some point, so that'll be another incentive if all of that other stuff isn't. So thank you very much. We're talking at this section about what is your technology worth, and I think the way the question's phrased, it assumes that it might be addressed to the entrepreneur, but there are those of us in every sector that have to undergo a process of deciding what something's worth, whether we're procuring it, whether we're building it, whether we're investing in it, or whether we're actually a patient deciding whether to use it or not. So I'd like to keep my remarks very brief and turn to my panel, and I actually just wanted to talk about the word worth very briefly, and the simplest definition is the value of something or someone that's under consideration. But it gets kind of complex because you want to know what is it worth, and that will depend on to whom. It will also depend on what's the currency you're talking about. Is it worth it to a patient because it really improves their lives, or the provider because it improves their workflow or their relationship with the patient? Or is it worth something financially, whether it's an ROI or a profit margin? So it's to whom and what currency, and then also at what stage in the development process are you assessing the worth? Because the worth is really a dynamic variable rather than just a static variable. But it's incredibly complex, and I'm going to turn to the experts here to weigh in on this. We're going to start with Lisa Sunin, and each will give you a little bit of background. I think Lisa probably needs no introduction, except she's a venture capitalist, and she's also got a very important voice in the ecosystem of digital health in her blog, Venture Valkyrie. So I'd like to hear from Lisa at this time. How do you assess worth, and how do you consider it from your vantage point in this arena?
Thanks, Aenor. Thanks so much. Nice to be back here after last night's event at the bar. So I'm really happy we've come full circle and they're serving alcohol again when I'm in the room.
There was more than one event at the bar.
That really improves the outcome of most panels, I find. And I come at this from the value, when somebody asks me what's this worth, I think about money, because my perspective is from the venture investment side. What's it worth to me in returns, measured in dollars, over a period of time, and that period of time for most venture investors is around 5 to 7 years-ish, right? So sometimes it goes longer because that's what happens. Sometimes it goes shorter because you got really, really lucky. But that's usually around the average, 6, 7 years for healthcare types of deals to exit, and probably a little longer if you're getting to more service-oriented type stuff. And when VCs think about what your technology is worth, it's a math problem. So I'm sorry, I know it's 4 o'clock on a Friday, but I'm going to make you do some math right now. Just brace yourself. Real simple math. There was about $4 billion, give or take, invested in digital health companies last year. And let's just, for the sake of argument, say that that $4 billion that was paid by venture capitalists to companies bought 1/2 of those companies, half the amount of stock of those companies. In other words, bought 50% ownership in each of those companies. So that means the total value of that pile of companies was $8 billion, the value of those companies in just basic dollar terms. That's how the math works. If you're the typical venture capital firm and you're trying to make, let's just call it 3 times your money, which is not what you're trying to make. You're trying to make 100 times your money, but you're going to be really happy for the most part if you make 3 times your money, because you're going to look better than most of your peers. Then that pile of $8 billion companies worth of stuff needs to be worth $24 billion, 3 times the 8, some number of years from now, okay? And that's a lot of money. And the reason that's a lot of money isn't because some of these companies aren't amazing and once in a while something's worth $1 billion, although that's the rare exception. But something like 60% of these companies just goes totally bust, right? Just worth 0, nothing. All that money's lost, gone. Something like 20% of those companies is worth around what you paid for them. 1 to 2 times your money, best case. So you're not making that 3x return. So the rest of the companies, the 20% that are left, have to make up for all that lost value. And so when venture capitalists think about it, they are trying to look for things that could make 10 times their money, on average, in a perfect world, to balance out all the zeros and the ones. And on top of that, you have to think about the fact that most of the time, more than half of the time, the deal value of a merger or acquisition deal, the purchase value, because most of these companies don't go public. You don't get to see Jack Young doing push-ups on Wall Street every day of the week. Most of the value of those companies is $100 million or less at exit. A lot less most of the time. So it's a very hard math problem to get to real value. And there's a lot of money coming into venture capital right now. And a lot of companies that are out there touting pretty high values for themselves. And sometimes they don't really help themselves by doing that, because you can turn what's a great product and a great idea and a great company into a terrible investment by its being overvalued, because you, the investor, lose money on it in effect. And so does the entrepreneur, who usually sits at the bottom of this payment stack when a company gets sold. So it's a really important math problem to think about when you're facing into the cold, steely, dead eyes of the VCs like myself. Thinking about the math from their perspective. I think on the M&A side, when I think about value, meaning the merger and acquisition, the acquisition of companies side, you think about who's buying these digital health companies. It's going to be either payers, it's going to be med tech companies, maybe some biotech companies eventually. It's mostly not hospital systems buying the companies, every once in a while. But it's usually the payers, the med tech, the biotech, and occasionally, out of left field, some tech company that's not in healthcare. They're looking at it a little differently. They're looking at, is this deal accretive, meaning does it add value to what I've got as compared to what I've got now? If I buy this thing for $1, will I get $2 or some numbers worth of value out of it, measuring it in terms of new revenue that I can get, new market I can approach that I'm not in already, greater market share, lower cost to do my business, or is it worth it just to eliminate a competitor and stop somebody else from getting it, even if I don't use it for anything and shut it down? So that's the math they're doing. If for every $1 I spend to buy something, how many dollars am I going to get back by pushing this through my sales force or by getting into a market I'm not already in? And that return is usually expected to come a lot faster, usually in 1 to 2 years after an acquisition, not 5 to 7 years. So you have to, again, think about the math that you're doing. You have to be able to create a path to integration with those companies that overcomes the cost of integration. So the synergy of new sales, for instance, is greater than the synergy of the expense. So that's how I think about value. Pretty cold, mean. But I think it's really important to remember that, particularly for entrepreneurs who are looking to get financed by people other than themselves. You got to remember in the end, this isn't about, for VCs, it's about making money.
Lisa, thank you very much. So you just saved yourselves the expense of an MBA at the Haas Business School, because that was very, very valuable and very dense. And I hope everyone recorded that. I'd like now to introduce Sarah Jane Miltello, who is the Director of Operations at the UCSF Samsung Digital Health Innovation and Validation Lab. And I'd be very interested in hearing your perspectives on how you consider worth from the validation side, or when you're going to integrate it with something else you're already doing.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Aenor. Yes, when I think about, particularly working with Samsung, I think, of course, about consumers. So when I really think about technology, I sort of look back to my career with medical device companies, with computer companies, analytical instrumentation. Much of what I did during those years related to support and service to help people use the products effectively. And in the more recent years, I've been implementing electronic health record solutions for physician practices and FQHCs, and helping large companies who are trying to use mobile health devices in their delivery of care figure out how to select those devices. So certainly from the perspective of the user, I think a lot of the products coming into the market today are not being accompanied with enough service so that users can effectively use this technology. And although we're all walking around with our smartphones and everybody can figure out, I suppose, Bluetooth, when you think about in the days when medical devices were coming into the market and you had a dedicated sales and service organization to hold the hand of the user to make sure they got the value out of it, today we're going to be all having mobile health devices in the hands of consumers. And how do you make sure they get the value out of that technology? If they don't know how to use it, if they can't get it started, if they can't pair it with Bluetooth, or they don't understand how to configure a router, all of those things I think really reduce the value of the technology. Frankly, they'll abandon it no matter, and so to some degree I think to the user the worth could be quite low. When I think about providers and implementing technology, I guess my observation was they, not too surprisingly, really struggle with evaluating technology and selecting the right technology. There are tens of thousands of apps now available. Pretty difficult to figure out the ones that can really bring the value to the patient and that the provider could really recommend if they're at that point. A corporation I was working with was trying to implement mobile health devices and said, we just don't have any way to go through all of these apps and figure out which ones to select. We know all of our employees will be using smartphones. We know that these need to be incorporated into their preventive health, approach, but we just don't know how to evaluate it. I think as well, sitting in a validation lab, the other thing we see, of course, is that many of the devices in the market, many of the solutions in the market, haven't been validated. Clinically, I think in terms of just the metrology, is it measuring accurately? Many of these products are coming to market without that rigor and without that quality. Sometimes, in the interest of getting the market fast, I think sometimes because there's very small startup companies bringing them to market who can't be great at everything, and it's very, very hard to get all that right when you're putting out, $150 devices. So I guess that would be my perspective around this technology is if you don't have the right level of service and support and help to people to select these, actually the worth of the technology could be very low to these buyers.
I think that's a really great point. And if they aren't validated against gold standard, et cetera, you can't rely on the data that they're pushing to you. You don't know if it is measuring what it says it's measuring. Right. Very, very good points. And now I'd like to shift just to it's the same line of thinking of what's of value to the user, but a little bit different perspective instead of just the support. How do you think, Bill, about things in an upfront manner at the very front edge of the design curve when you're considering whether a user is going to be able to use it and whether they're going to stay engaged with it? I didn't ask each of you to introduce yourselves, so I'll give the same brief introduction, and I don't mean to minimize in any way, but Bill's the founder of a long-standing healthcare design firm called Bridge, and so we're very fortunate to have him here today because he's had a long history in trying to figure these things out for people in healthcare.
Thank you. So, my company Bridge comes at the digital world through the regulated world, initially through devices, and of course increasingly into what would be described as ecosystem types of product where you might have a device associated with an app, associated with a cloud. So yes, we do really worry a lot about how can we make our customers, our clients' technology really useful, if you like, at the point of care or the point of self-care. And I encourage a broad understanding of what that means. It's not necessarily as simple as a point of care diagnostic tool or something like that. And I think the first question that we ask, and we ask our customers to ask, is that it's not just can your users use the product, it's will they use the product. And it seems like a fairly obvious question at some level, but it's something that doesn't get asked enough, because obviously many people here today have stated that, patients are often some of the most reluctant users. They don't really want to make a project out of their disease management. And to some extent, that's also true of healthcare professionals. They've got very busy lives. They don't want to add another thing in. So it's about things that'll help that are, obviously, you talked about Bluetooth and routers. It's how do you get that data in a seamless fashion so the user is frankly unaware that they're loading data up into the cloud and so on. And that counts for, we work with a lot of chronic disease people, and obviously they can be quite elderly and not necessarily tech savvy, but it gets there. And then the other thing is, of course, how do you make data actionable? Because that's what makes it attractive to use the product. And you could have a whole session on what makes data actionable. But there's many things that we can learn in the healthcare side, from things like go to a retirement planning site and use one of their animated things about how if you make if you save this much money, it's going to affect the way you build your savings. Those are kind of tips we can take on in healthcare about presenting data in more interesting ways. And then my next point would be that we've got to sort of cut through the whole engagement, gamification, adherence, behavior change kind of hype and say, what does that really mean? Particularly if you're coming from tech, where you're trying to understand and learn and come up to speed in the medical world. Now, obviously, many people here have pointed out how important it is to use user-centered design practices, dive in deep. And I think it's really getting to understand the point of care and self-care in that deep way that's going to really help you cut through what that means. People often cite these things like behavior change and adherence, and a word I'm not fond of, which is compliance, because it implies too much finger wagging. Let's stop finger wagging at our patients and healthcare professionals and try and think of coming to the same side of the boulder as them and pushing it with them in a much better direction. And I think there's a lot to be learned from research in behavioral psychology and behavioral economics, where they're doing a lot of, in the last few decades, fantastic work on understanding how we do change our behaviors. And I would recommend a book I read recently from the advertising industry, which is really waking up to behavior change. And even though it's written from the point of view of marketing and sales, actually so much of it is very relevant to our work in healthcare, in that it's about trying to make people change. And that's a book by Matthew Wilcox, which is called The Business of Change. And he's got lots of insights in it. It's a wonderfully succinct book summing up the things, and I've got no stake in this book, by the way. But I think one of the insights that he reminded me of that I've come across in my career is that it's one thing to think enthusiastically about your technology and think, my users are going to be excited about this new technology. And I think what we often don't do is think, what are they going to regret giving up? What are the difficulties they're going to have in giving something up? And an example would be in de-skilling a surgical procedure for a healthcare professional. They might be sensitive about not wanting to give that up. And on the other hand, when you think about the new generations of products that are coming out that are taking patients who are managing chronic disease, taking them out of the loop so much with closed loop systems that might require some intervention from them, you're now asking a patient to trust a machine and an algorithm where before they've been trained and taught to really manage that very tightly. So there's some challenges as we go through these transition periods. And then I think many, many users today have talked about the importance of really embracing user-centered design. And so I'm not going to flog that dead horse, but more to say that for those people coming from tech, you really have to grapple with what that means in medical, because we really do have very different usability problems. And I think where we've seen it be successful is where those entrepreneurs harness technical people with people that understand clinicians or are patient advocates when that sort of research and process takes place. And importantly, when you're developing a consumer app, you might go out with preference testing for a few apps. I thoroughly recommend that you don't start with a preference test or some comparison, and instead start with even a minimal amount of open inquiry, a less structured inquiry, so you let your users help shape that. And then, people talked a lot about user testing, and of course it's obvious to state that the real world is very different from the testing laboratory. And here we've seen interesting experiments by our clients in trying to use the Darwinian a Darwinian method to run several different alternative methods of, say, behavior change or adherence. And they cheat the products into existence for short trials by doing things like replace massive server applications by having a few nurses sitting in a room somewhere who are experts in the system trying to behave like an algorithm, and they're getting this streaming data from the patient. So you can evaluate a 50-patient trial or something in an interesting way without making a very big investment, because we don't necessarily know what's going to survive in a Darwinian sense. And my last point, which will no doubt be made by other designers as well, is to really never underestimate the power of delighting and engaging users with elegant design. I think there's a lot, as an industry, we can learn from the consumer world about how so much engagement comes from these small rewards that you get in using a product, and design, elegance, beauty do play a part in that. And I think that things like the smartphone world and so on has really driven home to people that, hey, you know, I really like using this product. Why was this old piece of medical technology I used so hard to use, and this phone is so easy to use? And I think never underestimate the power of that.
That was really wonderful summary, and some interesting points, because a lot of phrases get used over and over now. Once we understand, oh, that's important, then we say the phrase, but we might not understand the depth of it. We're going to have only a few minutes for questions, but I found it really interesting. Each of you hit on some very important points. I learned from you that there are some big differences between can a person use it and will a person use it, and using that as a framework is very helpful. And Sarah, I learned that it's really interesting not just to think about the product once you hand it off. Did they accept it at that point? Well, how are you going to have sustained engagement? And you really don't have that if you don't have truly plug and play, or if the friction is too much. People get tired of trying to keep the battery charged up if it's too inconvenient. And from Lisa, I learned that 3 times 8 is 24. So that was helpful. So what I'd like to ask each of you is, if you could tell us, are there deal breakers and are there deal sealers when it comes to worth? And maybe in those 2 areas, could you say, if I see something from your each perspectives and say, that is a deal breaker when I think about the worth of something, or that's a real deal sealer, or something really attractive to me or make me think that's worth something. And it's a little bit of a challenging question, so if you don't like it, answer anything you want.
11. No, just kidding. It's funny. Probably the deal sealer and the deal killer for most VC deals is the people. It's the thing that makes investors want to pay attention to your company, is the quality of the people presenting it and that run the business, and it's the thing that scares them the most if those people leave, and if you have a sense that they might move on. It's the thing that kills deals in M&A when the buyer is afraid they can't retain the employees to keep the business lively and going, and they spend a lot of time thinking about that. So I think the people, and intangible value as they may be, probably convey more than anything in many ways, particularly for the entrepreneurial type of startups that we're talking about. And I would just lastly say ROI and value is always in the eye of the beholder, so you need to convey your value in the terms that they think in, not in the terms you think in.
I guess I would say if I need to use your product and the only way I can reach you is online chat or by submitting a form to see when you get back to me that's a deal killer.
So I would talk about a decision that many companies have to make about, should I cross over into being a regulated digital product or stay on the side of not? And I think it's obviously a difficult decision, but you really need to ask it from a usability point of view and say that if by leaving off features that would take me into the regulated world, how much different is my product going to be useful for people? And an example would be that, say you're doing a product that helps someone dose, it measures blood glucose or something, and your product is going to give them insulin, potentially giving them insulin dosing advice, which of course crosses over into regulatory. Well, you have to ask, is it worth it? Does my product need to have that? And the ROI, I'm going to steal a leaf from Lisa's book, is that the ROI of usability is if you don't do it, some other company, if your product's not usable, some other company is probably going to eat your lunch, and the ROI is staying in business.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the things we can close on is, do you have a tip for the people in the audience, whether they're considering it from an investment standpoint, a user standpoint as a provider or a patient, or someone who's building technologies, a tip that would make their position or whatever they're offering, make it more worth it?
Well, I think I'd say the same thing in a way, which is the ROI, again, is in the eye of the beholder, whether they're a potential customer and a potential investor. I often hear companies come in and say, my product that I'm going to sell to health systems is going to help them save money by reducing the number of cases, admissions, services that need to be provided. And I say, that's great, but that hospital that you're targeting has 85% payment by volume, not value. So they don't like that. And maybe 10 years from now they will be, but you got 10 years to sell, so go, you know. You got to really understand who your customer is and how they measure.
Great.
I think I would say to manufacturers that I think really thinking more broadly beyond the functionality of the product and a little more to, have you really validated it? Can people really understand what it does? Can they really use it when they get it? Those kinds of things are going to make your technology far more valuable.
And my last point is really a repetition of what I said earlier on, particularly say in drug adherence and so on, where we're really going to try and move the needle in chronic diseases. It's asking that question, will your users use it, not just can they?
Great. Thank you very much, panel. And those are
Fantastic.
very nice summaries.
Fantastic.